What Once Was Mine, Chapter 39, Rapunzel. Now she was entirely alone. Rapunzel had to rescue herself this time, and not rely on others, her mother, a random girl, a famous thief, a white witch, to save her. She tried to focus on that while her hands were bound behind her, and she was thrown across the back of a horse, much more professionally than the previous time she had been tied up. Upon reflection, she realized that if she was becoming a connoisseur of how one is properly trussed up, there was something terribly wrong with either the entire world or her own life. She tried to summon her powers. She couldn't quite reach the moon charm she had made, but it didn't really matter. She was too exhausted to concentrate, and badly bruised with her head hitting the muscled, hard side of the horse with every hoofbeat. She couldn't even sleep at all, the jostling and bouncing. She simply lay there in a dazed state, half upside down, watching the shadowy shapes of trees pass by. At some point her weary and worn-out body must have finally given up. When she came to again, they were still riding, but she was sat up this time, in front of, and leaning against, another rider, a giant man almost the size of the horse he rode. Also, most of her hair had been bagged up, literally, and tied up in a sack hanging off her head like a giant snood made out of burlap. Pascal crept from his hiding place on her neck and put a delicate two-toed foot on her cheek. "I'm okay," she whispered. "What?" the guard demanded in a deep, guttural voice. "What?" she asked back. Confused and ultimately uninterested, the man lapsed into silence. "I think it's early morning. Day 9, just half past noon. I wonder what my hair can do now. I wonder if I could do something to him." A few tendrils of her hair had escaped the bag, delicately snaking down and touching the man's thigh. But now that she could reach it, where was the little charm she had made to help her focus? Rapunzel began to panic. She must have dropped it, or it had gotten somewhere since she had been kidnapped. "Come on, Moon. Moon, do your thing," she murmured desperately, trying to visualize the moon as it would be now. "Is it working?" she whispered, rolling her eyes to see if she could see the glow. Pascal nodded quickly. "Stop that," her captor hissed, whacking her on the back of the head. It hurt. Rapunzel saw black and then stars for a moment. "Save your tricks to impress the lady with." Lady? Lady Bathory? The one whose names made Flynn and Gina shudder? Rapunzel didn't try any incantations on her hair again. She would save that for the lady as a last-ditch effort. Soon they entered hilly scrublands. Fields larger than those of Haircross rolled up and down the landscape, devoted entirely to grain, but something about them seemed dry and barren. Lonely, run-down huts were few and far between, like islands on a fishless sea. The sun was hidden behind thin, soupy clouds, and everything looked forlorn. And then, of all the crazy things, a carriage rolled up to meet them. A fancy, noble carriage, like out of a fairy tale. It was coal-black, and drawn by 4 equally black horses. Painted on its side in blood-red and corpse-green was a slavering and ugly dragon curled around what appeared to be the sharpened tooth of a monstrous ogre. The driver was dressed in fine clothes and a plume on his hat, and the footman dressed fancily as well, but neither was fair to look at, each as big as Rapunzel's captor, with muscles and scars to match. They looked like a pair of villains who had been forced into velvet and leggings to play act. Not how she imagined the four-in hand of Cinderella. The footman leapt down, not lightly, and ran over to help her ease off the horse. She slid down ungracefully and pitched forward, almost hitting her head on the ground. Her fall was stopped just in time by the footman, who had, she noticed distractingly, nearly lashless grey eyes. That was all she could concentrate on as he led her, stumbling, over up to the carriage. "Apologies for my inappropriate handling of you," he said in a whisper that was lighter than she expected. "But I fear you would fall and break your pretty neck if I let you go freely." She wondered at the way he phrased that, almost as if she would do it on purpose. She stepped up carefully into the carriage. Any further thought she had that this was a vehicle for a princess was immediately dashed. There were sturdy bars across the window, a large deadbolt on the outside of the door, and personally, if she were designing a convent for comfortably traveling princesses, she would have covered the hard, plain bench with soft upholstery like velvet or chenille. Otherwise, it was so shiny, easily wiped. An order was cried. A whip applied to the horse's hind sides. The carriage began to roll. What would Flynn Rider do? He would somehow pick the lock of the door, even with his hands tied. She had no chance of that. She had no idea how. So she turned her attentions to the outside, to try to figure out where she was going, in case she managed to escape and needed to find her way home. They passed through a very dismal-looking town, seemingly empty. Only hints of its inhabitants appeared in cracks and alleys, shadows of bodies slipping away into the doorways and sounds of running. The few old people who remained on the streets turned from the carriage, spitting or making signs of the cross. It was like Rapunzel had wandered into one of the scarier parables about what happens to little girls who don't behave. After the terrible village, the road climbed steeply into the range of sharp, stony peaks. Gray escarpments rose like thick pages in a book, layers and slices falling away into gorges, crumbling into dust. What little greenery there was in these desolate highlands clung to the sides of the roads and the series of alpine meadows it connected. Suddenly the carriage was on a straightaway, a high bridge across a deep gorge. Rapunzel pressed her face against the window as hard as she could to get a look at her destination. It was a castle. A small one, far smaller than the palace on the island. Honestly, it wasn't more than a few Rapunzel towers thrown together behind a wall, with some interconnected buildings. These towers were pointed, polygonal, angry-looking. This was a keep at the end of the world, garnished against any and all intruders. If Rapunzel was still hoping for a rescue, the sight of the bleak, dull fortress before her utterly dashed that. The horses shuffled to a stop. Men in black and red outfits ran out and began to tend them. The footman put out a set of steps for Rapunzel to descend, unlocked the door, and gave her his kid-gloved hand for balance. Really, he circled her wrist with his thumb and finger. A slight squeeze let her know immediately that would happen if she tried to run. He would break her arm in two. Inside the castle seemed even colder than the chill mountain air, despite the preponderance of the tapestries, rugs, mirrors, candles, and even flowering benches and bowls of blossoms that crowded the space. All the furniture was ebony. All the decorations were in shades of black, red, and green of the heraldic dragon. The suits of armor standing forever at attention in the halls were smeary with tarnish, some of their banners falling apart with mold. The mixture of feminine touches and brutal reminders of the past was terribly confusing to Rapunzel's already rattled mind. "Here, my lady," the footman said, shoving her into a small room. He took out a small black knife and sliced through the bonds around her wrists. "You can take your hair down if you like, but if a single strand gets anywhere near the Countess, I'll stab you in the heart myself. Now wash yourself from the trip. You will sup with Bathory tonight. She likes her girls clean." He didn't leer, and he didn't stick around, either. Slamming and locking the door behind him, Rapunzel shook the handle, but it was solidly bolted. She examined the tiny room in despair. There was a basin of water, a linen wash rag, and even a bowl of scented oil and a brush for her nails. Not doing it, Rapunzel decided. She did look in the mirror. There were a lot of mirrors in the castle. This extravagance was unthinkable. Her cheeks were a little streaked with dust, and there were dry tracks where there had been tears. Down her face seemed a little different. Did her face seem a little different? Changed to the quick week and the strange week, the most adventurous week she's ever had? Pascal nuzzled her sadly. "I think we're in trouble," she murmured, and then she sat down, knees drawn up, to wait.